thing that intrigues me is I've known of you and read your work over many decades as a social researcher, as someone who's helped me understand, the country we live in. And here you've taken a turn. I don't know if it's to the left or the right, but you've taken a turn inwards, which and there's so much richness in this book. We're only going to have time to touch on certain aspects of it. But what was it that led you, Hugh, to change and look at the inner self as opposed to the external identity?
Yes, thanks, Warren. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. It certainly is a departure for me, and actually, I think it's neither a left nor a right, but an inward. It's kind of back to basics for me, back to a sort of pure psychology rather than social research or even social psychology. But you're right. Of course, all my professional career has been in social research, and all my writing has been, most of it, apart from the fiction, has been about social analysis, human relationships, how we're impacted by social change, etc. And to the extent that I've touched on the idea of the self, it's always been about the external social identity. And of course, identity has become a hyper-fashionable term at the moment. Everyone is obsessed about identity, all the way through to identity politics. Well, identity, of course, is like our outer shell. It's crucial to our sense of who we are, but it is a social construction. You don't find your identity by navel gazing or by gazing into the psychological mirror. You find your identity by looking around you, looking into the faces of the people who love you or work with you or who you live amongst, who will put up with you. Social identity is all about our differences. It's all about what makes an individual unique. And of course, we are fascinated, psychologists in particular have always been fascinated by individual differences. And what parent doesn't enjoy looking at their own kids and saying, isn't it amazing that the children from the same parents can be so different from each other? So whether it's gender or ethnicity or religion or politics or sense of humor or job or style or what car you drive or whatever cue, all of these things taken together make up our external, socially constructed sense of identity. And really that's the one that as a social psychologist I've focused on all these years. But actually my publisher said to me, isn't it time to acknowledge the other half of the story? And I thought that's true, really. It would be an interesting journey for me to say, okay, I know. I mean, it's a controversial point, as you know, Warren. Not everyone agrees that there is such a thing as the inner self. Plato certainly thought there was, and there's a long tradition in Western philosophy of there being an inner sense of self that's different from that external social identity. But that became a pretty unfashionable view in the 20th century when the existentialists were riding high and saying, no, there's no such thing as the inner self, the core, authentic self. There's just history. There's just what you do. There's just behavior. And the Skinner school of behaviorism in psychology said this. I mean, there was a psychologist, B.F. Skinner, many of the audience will be familiar with Skinner's work, I'm sure, who completely dismissed the idea even of the mind. He wasn't interested in what went on behind what I'm describing as the outer shell, how we appear, what we say, what we do, and the history of all that is all we are. Well, I was attracted to that, as many of us were during the 20th century, but I've come to a much more traditional view that behind the shell, there is some inner, that most of us at some point in our lives have a sense of the tension between how we appear and who we really are. Sometimes that's experienced as the tension between our sense of independence and our sense of interdependence. And that's really that's really my starting point for the journey in this book into the whole idea of the inner self, because it seems to me I think this is lovely, and it hadn't occurred to me till I started writing the book. But when we go deeply into who we are, we get further and further away from the sense of our uniqueness and closer to our sense of common humanity. So it seems to me that the thing that social psychologists like me are mainly concerned with is our differences, our uniqueness, our exteriority, if you like. But behind all of that, there is this sense that we are inescapably part of this sort of shimmering vibrating web of interconnectedness, and that the idea that we share our humanity, that we need each other, that we belong to a social species that can't really survive, let alone thrive, unless it forms associations, relationships, groups, families, neighborhoods, etc. That is, I think, the deepest truth about us. And that sense of our common humanity, which maybe we can explore a bit, but that sense of our common humanity seems to me far more significant than what we think of as the more fascinating things that divide us and distinguish between us. Sorry, that was a very long answer to it.
Hugh, what's really struck me about the book is that you look at so many ways that we avoid spending time with our inner self. And I felt really confronted when I read the book, because I thought, yeah, I spend a lot of time with my inner self, I meditate, but actually you list 20 ways that we avoid actually spending time with the inner self. It's like we're always running away from the inner feelings, and you talk about inner darkness as well. And some of the things I'm just looking here that you mentioned are addictions, ambition, anxiety, technology. Since I've read your book, I've noticed that in all my spare time, I go through and look at Twitter to see if there's any notifications, like many people do. I look at Facebook, I look at Instagram, and I felt a bit shocked and ashamed at how much I'm really not using time where there's nothing to do to be with myself and just look at what's going on, but to run away from myself.
Yes.
And,
Your
thoughts about how we run away.
Yes. Welcome to the human race, Warren. I mean, this is, to me, the most I think this is actually a way of explaining a lot of human behavior that is otherwise quite difficult to explain. So if we just go back for a moment to this idea of our common humanity, because I think that is what we experience when we go deeply into our sense of self, it's not surprising to say that the one quality we need in order to fully function as members of a social species is, fortunately, the quality that we humans are all blessed with, which is our capacity to show compassion. I mean, we are, and there are lots of ugly things to say about humans, but a wonderful, glorious thing to say about humans is we have this extraordinary capacity to show kindness, compassion, respect, tolerance, etc., towards total strangers, towards people we don't like much, towards people we could never agree with. I think, it's important to think of compassion as not really an emotion at all. It's not like affection. It's a form of love, but it's not like the emotional loves. It's the form of love that says, well, now I get that we are members of this social species together. Obviously, maintaining social cohesion, promoting social harmony is kind of my duty or my destiny, or whatever word you want to use, as a member of this species. And so luckily, because I'm human, I have this extraordinary capacity for compassion. That's what the species demands of me, that I promote harmony by treating other people kindly, etc. However, to come to the hiding problem, this is obviously very demanding. I mean, it's the core quality of humans. I think of it, in fact, a metaphor that I used in the book was we could think of compassion as being like the sun at the center of our personal solar system, but like the literal sun, it casts shadows. You know, in our folklore, we say, you know, there's often a fine line between love and hate. It's as though love, the bright light of love, casts a shadow of hate, and compassion casts all sorts of shadows. Even our surges of faith and hope cast shadows of doubt. But the thing about being human, being true to the noblest aspect of human nature, which is our compassionate self, is demanding. It's not something you can do 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There are times when we suffer compassion fatigue. There are times we just don't want to be kind to someone. There are times we don't want to be tolerant because our prejudices overwhelm us, and we don't want to be respectful to someone that we hold in contempt. It's not surprising that we do look for ways to hide from the demands of love. I mean, even in the emotional meanings of love, like romantic love or familial love or the love of companionship, that's very demanding too. And there are times when we want to hide from those demands, and we can be quite unpleasant to people who we otherwise love. And in our general life as a neighbor, as a colleague, as a citizen, as a member of this species, there are times when it's all too much, and I think that's natural. But where it's a problem is when we find somewhere, this comes to the list that you mentioned, where we find a hiding place where we're very comfortably insulated from having to confront this core truth about ourselves. I mean, you mentioned busyness on that list. Busyness is a great contemporary hiding place. If you can stay busy, then you can hide from everyone else, but you can also hide from yourself. Because if you keep running, you don't even have to ask why you're running so hard. But yes, we can be hiding from ourselves in information technology because there's always stimulation going on there that can distract us. But we do need some distraction. I mean, it's one reason why you mentioned that you're a meditator. It's one reason why we need every day something like meditation or quiet reading time or walking time or participation in creative or performance activities like singing, dancing, painting, drawing, writing, whatever it might be, which is personal replenishment time. I don't think of that as self-indulgence at all. I think of that as the time we need for recharging the batteries so we can go on with the demanding business of being a human.
Hugh, it makes me think of the fact that when I do waste a lot of my time on Twitter, I see a lot of people saying, yes, I like you because you believe what I believe, but I don't like you because you believe something different. And when I look at politics, you know, it sort of makes one very, it's all about, I like people like me, but I can't love someone who's, you know, has these different beliefs to me. It seems to be almost a disease in our culture today. But you, I think, make a really good point that for us to have love, empathy, and compassion for others, we need to, you mentioned Carl Jung's idea of the shadow. We need to go in and also learn about the darkness within ourselves so we can be more tolerant of the imperfections in others.
Yeah, absolutely. I think all of us are conscious of we're all conscious, aren't we, of the struggle between the light and dark, you know, the metaphorical sun and the shadows that it casts. In fact, one reason why some people will say, when I was writing this book, people would say, what's your next book about? And I'd briefly, I don't want to know. I'm not going to go inside. I'm scared of what I'd find. You know, in fact, one member of my extended family said, no, hiding from myself, that's my strategy for living. I don't want to know about the dark stuff. Well, if we don't want to know about the dark stuff, if we don't confront it, what's going to happen? I think we don't have to get into psychoanalytic psychology, Freudian philosophy, or any of that. We can just look at what happens when dark stuff within us is allowed to fester and isn't faced and isn't dealt with. It can often erupt in very negative ways. It can come out as anger or even violence because we didn't acknowledge that it was there. Now, I think there are two reasons, apart from that, but just being healthy to face it and deal with it. But I think there are two other reasons why we shouldn't fear facing the darkness in ourselves. One is that there's never only darkness. There's always light as well. The fact that there's a shadow means that there's light. And the other thing that you touched on, I think, it reminds us that everyone is in this state. That when other people are behaving in ways that we think of as irrational or unpleasant or antisocial or something, they are probably trapped in a shadow. And it's an important reminder that the shadows are there because the light is there, because we are lit, we are enlightened, energized by this capacity we have for compassion. It's bound to produce some darkness as well. But by the way, can I just go back to your comment about the sort of echo chamber effect of social media, the fact that people like you because you said something they agree with. This is a kind of microcosm of life in general, isn't it? That we are naturally attracted towards, we have more affection for people who seem to agree with what we think, that there's a sense of affinity and compatibility and all that sort of stuff, understandably. But one reason why I'm a great believer, and I think this is one of the benefits, if we can use that word, of the pandemic, many people have rediscovered their own local neighbourhood, their own street, their neighbours in their apartment block or across the road, people that they had never encountered before, but now suddenly in conditions of restricted movement, we become more conscious of the neighbourhood. I think the neighbourhood is like the test bed of our capacity to exercise, or of our willingness and ability to exercise our capacity for compassion. Because in the street where you live, there are all kinds of people. That's not like an echo chamber. Unless you're one of those strange people, and they do exist, who knocked on everyone's door in the street before you decided to buy or rent in that street to see if it was a compatible group. Mostly we don't do that. Mostly, by the way, I've just lost vision. I hope you haven't lost me. Can you?
We can see you, Hugh. We can see you nice and clear and hear you.
Good. Yes, we find ourselves when we move into a new neighbourhood. We find we are surrounded by people we didn't choose to live amongst, and some of them are different ethnicity from ours, different religion, different culture, different tastes in music, different child rearing practices, etc., and all that sort of stuff emphasizes that that's how the human species is. We do have all these individual differences, but the neighbourhood is a wonderful test of whether we can get through to our common humanity and treat all those different people who are not going to become our best friends. Some of them might, but there's this very important category of neighbour, which I think is a really good test of whether we've got the idea of compassion, whether we understand that because someone who lives in our street is at risk of social isolation, maybe that became more obvious during the pandemic, or someone is frail and elderly, or there's a single parent, or someone dealing with a disability or with a mental illness, or some other reason why they might be feeling at risk of social isolation. They are part of our responsibility as humans to exercise particular compassion in those cases.
Which brings me to my next question. How do we get to know the inner self of others in this Instagram world?
Yeah, Um, Look, I think all we really get to know of others is their social identity. I mean, with your nearest and dearest, with people with whom you have an intimate relationship, you learn a lot more, particularly about the darkness, about the light and shade, the internal struggles that people are going through. But generally speaking, in normal social discourse, we have to go by that social identity. We go by age, gender, ethnicity, style, etc. And we need to accept that those people, as they appear to us, are neighbours or our companion at a bus stop or whatever it might be. What's going on, and they are all human. I mean, so we then go to our deeper inner self, our sense of common humanity, and we recognise that these people, whether they recognise it or not, these people share a common humanity with us. And many wise philosophers and mystics and other people through the millennia have said we only truly become ourselves through our relationships with other people. We're only fully realised as humans in our social context. It's like saying that anyone we meet is part of who we are. That's another pretty ancient idea, which I think contemporary social psychology would strongly confirm, that when we are isolated from the human herd, we are at risk of not just mental illness like depression and anxiety, but physical illness, inflammation, hypertension, cognitive decline, all these things that are associated. I mean, in our prison system, solitary confinement is the worst punishment we can think of. So we've been doing a mass experiment in solitary confinement around the world at the moment. But the point I'm making is that whoever we encounter, we don't need to know, unless they want to reveal it to us, we don't need to know what's going on at a deeper level in someone else. We can take them at face value and accept their humanity, whether they've faced that or not. As I said a moment ago, we've faced it. Once we know this, there's no escape, it seems to me, from behaving in a way that is true to our finest sense of what it means to be human. And that doesn't mean everyone becomes our best friend and we love everyone in the emotional sense and we want to join hands and sing happy songs with everyone we meet. Not at all. Being compassionate doesn't mean being soft in the head, or being a doormat or a martyr to everyone else's demands on us, but it does mean that kindness and respect and tolerance towards everyone we meet will become our daily discipline. That'll become our way of being in the world. That I think is the sign of a person who is in touch with their deep sense of humanity that they exhibit. Those positive qualities, even when they're dealing with, and this is, it might be true in your own street, even when you're dealing with someone you could never agree with about religion or politics or anything else, someone you don't even like much. But Samuel Johnson said, we're capable of kindness even when, I haven't got the words exactly right, but something like this, we're capable of kindness even when we're not capable of fondness.
When the phrase that comes to mind, it's rather unfashionable too, is love your enemy.
Yeah.
And maybe the enemy within yourself as well.
Yes.
I'll just shift the focus a little bit to actually read a little bit of the text so people get an idea of your writing, which I think is just beautifully clear and it's so rich. I don't think we've given it as much credence as we can so far. But you talk about anxiety as a hiding place. But you talk about anxiety not so much as clinical anxiety, but something we're all seen to be experiencing as a society. So I'll just read the paragraph and would love to hear your thoughts. The epidemic of anxiety in Western societies is associated with some radical changes in our way of life that have been pushing us in the direction of greater social fragmentation. Things like our high rate of relationship breakdown, our shrinking households. Every fourth Australian household now contains just one person. More high density housing, fueling an antisocial obsession with privacy and security, increasing mobility in countries like Australia and the US. We move house on average once every 6 years, and a heavy reliance on IT at the expense of personal encounters. Do you think we are becoming more anxious? And is that got something to do with the fact that we're not in touch with our inner selves as much as we could be?
I certainly do, Warren. Yes, it's a good way of putting it. I think again, it's a double-sided thing. I think the rising level of anxiety around the Western world, not just in Australia, but it's certainly. I mean, the Australian Psychological Society, in conjunction with Swinburne University, published some research just within the last 2 years, which showed that 25% of Australians feel lonely most of the time, most of every week. Now that to me is a chilling statistic, and it's closely related to our what is now being described as our epidemic of anxiety, because this goes back to what it means to be a human. If we experience loneliness, if we experience social isolation, in other words, if we're cut off from the sense of belonging to a functioning human herd, whether that's a neighbourhood or an extended family or a workplace or whatever it might be, then we are almost bound to experience anxiety, in some cases depression, in some cases just a vague restlessness, a vague feeling that all is not well, because it is our nature as humans to be herd animals. So I think, I mean, anxiety, there are many contributing, you're a psychiatrist and I'm not. Obviously, there are many contributing factors to anxiety in individual cases, but when we're dealing with anxiety on an epidemic scale, I think we can look to those sort of social factors that you just read out from the book and say, what is the cumulative effect of those changes in our society? And the cumulative effect is we have become more socially fragmented. And that's associated with the rise of individualism, the me culture, the sense of ourselves as individuals, my independence, overwhelming our sense, getting in the way of our sense of ourselves as members, as belonging to each other, as having this, being in this thing that I described as the vibrating web of interconnectedness. I think when we lose that, when we have the sense of ourselves as individuals, it's a short step to feeling as if we are isolated individuals. And that for most people, that sense of being socially isolated, perhaps even socially excluded, does lead to feelings of anxiety. And by the way, just mentioning social media again from memory, it's one of the ironies of the age of anxiety, or this particular age of anxiety. It's one of the ironies that the people who report the highest levels of loneliness are the heaviest users of social media. So we've got this strange phenomenon that I discuss in the book where we're called connected but lonely. It applies particularly in the this Australian Psychological Society research identified the 18 to 25 age group as a particularly vulnerable age group to feelings of loneliness and corresponding feelings of anxiety and depression, while at the same time being, in the digital sense, highly connected. But we know that form of connection is not what brings the human herd together. I mean, we're doing it tonight, and it's a really good substitute for the real thing. Mm-hmm. But in fact, it doesn't really compensate for the lack of all the richness of human interaction when we're in the same place, in the same time, and in particular, making eye contact with each other.
While we're on the topic, which I think is a fascinating one, of the social and structural causes of anxiety in our society, it's a good opportunity to mention your novel, which I absolutely love, A Question of Love. And there's a character in that novel who is an architect, and he says something about the fact that he creates environments to decide how connected people will be.
Yes.
And I love that idea. And so I'm thinking, if I need to get in touch with both my inner self and other people to get in touch with my inner self, and thereby with other people, where am I going to get that connection? Will it be at Woolies? I don't think so. At the shopping mall? Probably not. In church? Well, not many of us go to church these days. That was a time where we would get in touch with our inner self. But where do we go in today's society to get in touch with our inner self and get that sense of connectedness with others?
Yeah, it's interesting.
Architects to help us more.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned in that context, you mentioned the historical role of the local church in that, because of course it did have a huge role to play in the past, a very small role in the present, though there's some very persuasive, I covered this in a previous book, a book called Beyond Belief, but there's some very persuasive research that demonstrates the link between mental health and religious faith and practice, that people who are regular church attenders do tend to have less incidence of anxiety and depression, quicker bounce back from depression, lower blood pressure, less incidence of heart disease, etc. I mean, it's all very interesting. I don't know whether anyone would decide to go to church in order to get their blood pressure under control, but there is that. And of course, a big part of what that's about is not just that having faith in something greater than ourselves does tend to have a positive effect on our sense of well-being, but also, of course, the going to church or to the synagogue or the temple or whatever it might be is a socializing experience, so that it's being part of a faith community that really does enhance people's sense of well-being. So what are the contemporary alternatives and substitutes for that? The neighbourhood, of course, is one. That many people now do socialise with their neighbours. There are people who have, Friday night drinks in the street, which is a really lovely way of ensuring that we are maintaining a sense of a herd that we belong to. Some people have that feeling of strong connection with colleagues in the workplace. Many people, and in the context of avid reader, it's worth mentioning the book club phenomenon, which is a huge phenomenon around Australia. And, you so often hear people who belong to book clubs saying that there comes a point in the conversation where someone will usually say, don't you think we should say something about the book? Because they've been having a wonderful interaction and a sense of connection. And many of those book clubs, I think, do provide a framework for people to go quite deeply into their sense of human connectedness. The community choir phenomenon, which is booming, it was booming before the pandemic. It's a very unhealthy thing to do in terms of germ transmission, but a very healthy thing to do in terms of creating community connections, community gardens, all of these kind of activities, which I think as good citizens, as humans who understand the need to promote social harmony and social cohesion, it's good for us to engage. As you say, you're not going to engage much in an accidental encounter in the supermarket aisle. We need to provide encounters where there's a bit of time to spend. By the way, I think those incidental encounters are also very important for maintaining our sense that we belong to a neighbourhood and there are all these other people, and we better at least greet them and acknowledge that they are on the planet and we're sharing this space. But we do need opportunities, whether it's in the extended family or the neighbourhood or any of these other contexts I've mentioned, to go into our sense of connectedness a bit more deeply, to be a bit more open to each other, and to let our common humanity shine through all of our individual differences. I mean, back to the book club experience, many people will say, well, we've argued ferociously about the book. There's one woman in our group who never seems to like the same books as everyone else, but we still love her. She's still part of the group, and she still comes along, and we connect, even though we're connecting over disagreements. By the way, I think that's an important little point to add to our earlier conversation. Adopting the discipline of compassion, becoming truly human, doesn't mean we're all going to agree with each other. I mean, it can exist. You can terminate a relationship kindly. You know, you can do everything kindly and respectfully. It's just a way of being.
There's so many ways we can hide away from the self that you refer to in the book so beautifully, and I love how you use you have lots of people, just ordinary people, telling their stories about how they sort of realised they were hiding from their true selves.
Yes.
But you also have lots of lovely quotes from very wise philosophers over the years. And the very first line in the book I'd love to read out. It's by Soren Kierkegaard, an existentialist, who said, "The deepest form of despair is to choose to be another than oneself." What do you take that to mean, Hugh?
Yes, I think that's a kind of a searing quote to me. That when I came across that Kierkegaard quote, it really stayed with me as a reference point, really, for the writing of the book, because what he's saying is, if we hide from, or the way I interpret it in the light of this particular book, if we hide from the truth about who we really are and just settle for the externals, or even pretend to be someone that isn't true to who we really are, we will experience that as despair. Now, despair is a pretty strong, troubling word. You could break that down to a slightly less intense word. In fact, I think when many people reach the middle years of their lives, typically in our 40s or 50s, many of us do experience this phenomenon popularly called the midlife crisis. Mm. And I think that's what this is often about, Warren. I think it's coming to a point in our lives where we realise that we're not actually being true to ourselves, that we got absolutely hung up on the externals. In fact, I opened the book with a little story about the British actor Emma Thompson, who on the eve of her 60th birthday, so that was a bit later than for many of us, but on the eve of her 60th birthday, suddenly got interested in the question of who she really is. And she said, for all her life, she'd been wearing, she didn't use the word masks, but effectively she was saying wearing the mask of mother, daughter, wife, and in particular actor and celebrity and public figure. Mm-hmm. And she said she had suddenly reached the point where she could take all those things away from her face and ask herself the question, who am I really? Now, I think some young people come to that question early in life. I think that's unusual. I think it's much more like a midlife experience to say there is some sense of, another person that I quote in the book, an American psychiatrist, Robert Beresin, who talks about eventually the sense of an authentic self asserting itself. And that's what Kierkegaard, I think, is saying, that at some point, if we don't admit the authentic self, if we don't get to this deep understanding of what our common humanity asks of us, then we will be in despair. We may not recognize it as despair. It might come up as depression or anxiety or restlessness or something. And we may not even recognize its source. The breakthrough moment, the moment of personal enlightenment, will be when it occurs to us that this restlessness, this feeling that I'm not actually being true to myself, or, as people often say in the midlife crisis, there's more to life than this, there's more to me than this. That's the breakthrough moment when we say, okay, what is the inner self? Now, at that moment, it's not as though the outer self, what I was describing as our social identity, is not as though that falls away. We still need that. But now that becomes far less important to us, and our inner deep sense of what it means to be an authentic human being.
There's another lovely quote at the beginning too, Hugh, which is by Donald Winnicott, the psychoanalyst and paediatrician. "It is a joy to be hidden and a disaster not to be found."
Yes, yes, that's a quote from I'm a bit of a fan of Winnicott in many ways, but it's a quote from a book he wrote called Play and Reality, I think it's called, in which he talks about games and how they are children's games and how they are often like little metaphors of human experience and human life. And yes, he's making the point in the game of hide and seek. It's an absolute thrill to be hidden. You love getting into your little hiding place and having this powerful sense that no one can see you, and other people are out there trying to find you. The person who's in is trying to locate you, etc. So it's a joy to be hidden. But then there comes the moment in the game where you need to be found, and if the other people playing this game, make the point in the book, if the other people playing the game suddenly just lost interest and said, "Oh, we can't find Hugh, forget it, let's go and play footy," it would be a disaster. You'd say, "Well, no, I need you to find me. Don't just go away and abandon me." And I think that is a lovely picture of this journey, this inner journey, this getting in touch with the inner life. Yes, we can hide in our busyness, we can hide in our materialism or our nostalgia, or one of our favorite hiding places is projection, where we criticize other people for the very frailties that we ourselves have. But there comes a time when we have to face up to all that. And it's a disaster for us not to face up to it and to go on for too long, never having got in touch with our deeper, more authentic human person.
And while we're quoting philosophers, you've also got a lovely quote by Martin Heidegger that he spoke of anxiety as, says of anxiety that its breath quivers perpetually through man's being. And what that brings up to me is mortality. All the existentialists understood that when we actually realize we are going to die and it's going to be soon, that can be the wake-up call to look into the inner self. And you quote Carl Jung a lot too in the book, and his reminds me of a lovely book I read quite a few years ago about modern man in search of meaning, where he talks about in the second half of life, we're more likely to become introverted, to look inward, to say, what am I here for? And your book reminded me a lot of that.
Yes, there's this famous U curve, isn't there, Warren, based on global research about people's sense of well-being and life satisfaction at various stages through the life cycle. And what the curve suggests is that our sense of life satisfaction declines through adolescence and early adulthood and through to our middle years. But in the second half of life, if we're spared to live a normal kind of span, our sense of life satisfaction increases. So typically people in their 50s, 60s and 70s are experiencing greater life satisfaction than they did in their 20s, 30s and 40s. And I think what we're talking about is the probable main explanation for that, that in the second half of life, we are much less concerned about maintaining some kind of image, some kind of external social identity, much less concerned about the question of identity itself, and much more concerned about the state of our inner life and whether we are in fact in tune with this common humanity that we share with everyone else. It's a magic moment, I think, when people really get that, and it produces a deepening in our sense of life satisfaction.
And your comments remind me of that piece of research by a palliative care nurse, Bonnie, I've forgotten her surname, but the topic of her book was the things that people regret, the things that the dying people regret. And the top regrets of the dying were they didn't spend as much time with their friends, that they spent too much time worrying what people thought about them rather than expressing what they really wanted to do in life, and that they spent too much time at work. And I noticed you list work as one of the ways that we hide from ourselves.
Yes, absolutely. People who cling. I mean, in a moment of confession, I should admit, there have been periods in my life where I've certainly hidden in work. And of course, it's a terrific hiding place because you tend to be praised for it. People say, you know, this person's got such a commitment to their work and they're so passionate about their work. And so you tend to be praised, but often it can be a place where you can focus so much on the job that you actually forget about the self, and the job doesn't connect you to other people. That's why there's that nurse remarked. The regret is about the fact that work, we hid in work from an encounter with our authentic inner self, which means, I mean, that's why I said at the outset, the encounter with the inner self is not a selfish thing. The encounter with the inner self is all about suddenly understanding that we are part of each other, that we are infinitely connected. I mean, really, you could go further than saying we're connected to each other. You could say we're connected to all these ecosystems that are mutually interdependent.
In terms of work and busyness, sorry, there's just one other thing. A lovely thing that you have in both books actually is this observation of when we're asked, when people say, how are you? They say, how are you? Busy? And people say, oh, really busy, as if that's sort of somehow noble, but it's sort of sad in a way that we see busyness as a measure of how we're going rather than happy, you know?
Yes, there's a very intense encounter between the two main characters, Richard the architect and Freya the violinist in the novel, The Question of Life. A very intense encounter on that, so where they're almost having an argument about who's busier than the other, and they're each accusing the other of being too busy, and their busyness coming at the expense of the relationship itself.
Yeah, I think Chrissy's going to ask you questions. Yeah.
We have some questions from the audience, so I'm going to go to some questions. Thanks so much. This has been absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure that people will go back to this conversation when we put it up on YouTube, because there's so much to pick apart in it, especially after reading the book too, or the books, as we may say, because they're interrelated, the two, the non-fiction and the fiction. So going on from that idea of collective understandings that you were just talking about, we have a question from Elizabeth Hurst, who asks you about collective consciousness and your views on that. In particular, I suppose, in relation to Jung, she says, but I think in general, the idea of collective consciousness.
Yes, well, Jung expressed it as the collective unconscious, and Warren will be more of an authority on this than I am, but the understanding being that there are things that we talk about the unconscious mind, but there are things that seem to be shared between the unconscious mind across the species, things that we seem almost to know without having experienced them. And I'm not a Jungian in that sense. I'm not an advocate for psychoanalysis, or I'm more Jungian than Freudian. I'm deeply skeptical about Freud, but it does connect to this idea that we've been exploring tonight, which I do strongly believe that once we have a sense of our common humanity, then we are actually more open to the idea of sharing experiences, thoughts, insights, etc., with other people, learning from other people at a deeper level than just "G'day, how are you going?" But the mystical sense of the collective unconscious, I'd reserve judgment on, but I'd be very interested in your view on that, Warren.
Look, I think one of the things I find most fascinating about Carl Jung's idea of the collective unconscious is this idea of common archetypes and common stories and myths. And, you know, I've been watching a lot of Netflix lately with COVID-19, and it just runs through all these lovely mythological ideas. So I think for the writers in the audience and the readers, there does seem to be something in those common mythological ideas across cultures. But we do have another question, Chrissy?
We do, yeah. And I'll also direct people to our conversation with Merlin Sheldrake, the mycologist, who touches on this idea of collective consciousness based on the idea of mycology and mushrooms and fungus and the way it connects all the creatures in a forest. So have a look at that too. It's very interesting. And that leads to our next question, because Meg Boland has talked a little bit about other species. So she says, you mention empathy, but it appears that just by the definition of it, as reflecting a social being within one's society, it is unique to humans, which seems to make it tautological in some sense. Can you visualize an empathy within other species, such as dogs, or across species, interspecies empathy?
Absolutely. This is a lovely question, and I just touched briefly on this when I talked about thinking of ourselves as part of an interconnected series of ecosystems. I think we can. I think we. I'm talking about the need for compassion, empathy, tolerance, kindness, respect, all these things, as being essential to the survival of the human species. When we lose those things, we become less than human. But I think we are beginning to understand that we are part of an ecology, that it's not just about survival of this species, it's about survival of the planet. And I think it's absolutely sensible, indeed urgent, for us to extend the notion of empathy to the planet. To be thinking not just about how we treat each other, but how we treat other species, and not just animals, insects, etc., but plants as well. I mean, pretty obviously, we've neglected that aspect of empathy. And I think this whole idea of the inner self, of being in touch with our sense of common humanity, it's just an absolutely logical, natural, easy extension of that to say it's not just our common humanity, but it's our common existence with the cosmos, and in particular this planet.
I love that, and I love the fact that we're beginning to go back to Indigenous knowledge and to Indigenous peoples who still, look at animals and plants and rocks as having personhood, and that changing the idea of looking at an animal as a person and having personhood changes everything, really.
Yes.
And possibly saves us from climate destruction. So Donna has just piped in with a little comment, which I'll read because we love it, about book clubs. Absolutely love mine. Have been missing, even though we're meeting on Zoom, missing the physical book club during lockdown. And we love the discussions that divide the group. So that's a wonderful thing too for book clubs. Now, Peter Nisbet has said, I'm interested to understand if you think there's a special order to read all of your books. Beyond the oldest to the newest, or is there a pattern, a way to read them? Is there a grand narrative? Is there a grand narrative to the book?
Well, I certainly wouldn't apply the word grand, but I've not been asked this before, and so I immediately think back, and of course there is a thread that runs through most of what I've written, both fiction and non-fiction. And it's my perspective as a social psychologist that our relationships are crucial to our well-being, our sense of belonging, of being accepted, of being taken seriously. I mean, in the book, What Makes Us Tick, I talked about the 10 desires that drive us, and the most fundamental and ubiquitous of those being our desire to be taken seriously. And that relates to the central theme of The Good Life, a book that followed that, which is all about the good life being a life lived in the context of rich and authentic human relationships. So I suppose in a sense, although I said in response to Warren's opening question that the inner self was a departure because it was a much more focused turning inwards, and yet of course the paradox of the self, when we turn inwards, what we discover is our common humanity all over again, that in fact we are richly completed as humans only to the extent that we connect with others. So I guess that's the grand narrative, if there is one, and it certainly runs through my fiction as well. And these two new books were literally published on the same day. That was the publisher's idea. I don't yet know whether it was brave or courageous in the Yes Minister sense to publish 2 books on the same day, but they are complementary, as Chrissy said. I mean, the question of love is a very intense case study of a marriage, a forensic look at a marriage, adapting the musical theme and variations structure, which is like the jazz improvisation structure, to the written word, where we establish a theme and then go through lots of variations and then come back to the theme at the end. But the underlying message is the same one. And so the question of love and the inner self could almost be read simultaneously. So I guess the answer is start with the newest and work back through some of those previous books. There will be certainly a common theme, but I hope it's evolved a bit as I've gone on.
If I can add to that, I would definitely commend the novel. It's a beautiful description of 2 people in a relationship not really knowing each other, and the tragedy of that, and how perhaps they could access their inner selves. It's really masterfully done, and I really enjoyed the novel.
And
Thank you,
maybe those book clubs that are here tonight might think about reading both of them in parallel, so that you can discuss how the thoughts that are articulated in a non-fiction way in one are expressed fictionally in the other.
And I know we're running short of time, but it struck me as I read the fiction that literature and fiction is one way that we access the inner self of others, because it gives us a chance to really understand what characters are thinking. And we don't get a lot of that in actual life, unless we're psychotherapists or something else. So I just thought fiction's a great device for accessing the inner self.
Very true. And I'd just like to say that the last question from Peter Nisbet was being zoomed in from Woodfordia, which is yet another way that people connect here at Woodford, you know, where we come together to talk arts and plant trees and that sort of stuff. So it's really great that here in Queensland we're able to do some of those things again.
Hugh, can I ask you one last question before Chrissy closes us? You've been writing for 60 years. You've written 8 novels. I didn't know that until recently. In a COVID year, you've published 2 books. You put a lot of us writers to shame. What's next for you, Hugh?
Well, at the moment, it's a secret project. But of course, I'm always writing, like you. If you call yourself a writer, you have to be writing. So both these books, of course, were written well before the pandemic hit. They were supposed to have been published in April, so it was postponed until August. So suddenly there were all these months with nothing to do. So yes, of course, I have been playing with a number of new ideas, and I hope some of them will come to fruition soon.
It's been such a pleasure to meet with both of you. Warren, those were very insightful questions. And Hugh, as always, it's a delight. And I leave here with lots to think about. And that will take us through quite a while once reading your book as well. So I'm going to open the room up. So basically, I'm going to allow participants to unmute themselves so that we can get together as a community with one last clap. To thank you both for being here with us today. So if you can unmute yourself if you're near your button, let's clap for Hugh and for Warren.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Warren.
Yes, thank you, Hugh. It's been wonderful to talk with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you.